Look, I'd like to say first that I absolutely share my colleagues' concern for the environment. Not so much the waves of migrants drowning us, I should get it right, at the beach. But as I was listening to his remarks, I was kind of reminded of the scene in my own house this morning. My daughter was in the bathroom and my son was, banging on the door for her to get out. She calls out, "I was here first." Now my son said, no one needs to take a 40-minute shower. And, the environments like that, we've got to stop doing the same thing. We can't metaphorically close the door. We actually need to take real action on the environment and on many of the problems that my colleague pointed out. But blaming immigration for our environmental policy failures has got to stop. And it's the absolute same with cities and housing. We need a step change in urban and housing policy in Australia. Rather than putting the fix on immigrants, we need to call out the real problem: politicians and the sorry state of national political debate. No, I'm very sorry if there are any politicians in the room. I do not mean to cause offence. You're not all the same. To start, I want to define the proposition for tonight's debate that we should curb immigration. Now, the Cambridge Dictionary tells us that to curb means to control or limit something that's not wanted. And when people talk about immigration and say it's not wanted, what they normally mean is it's the effects of immigration, not immigrants themselves, that aren't welcome. For instance, just last week, our Prime Minister announcing those cuts to immigration said, and I'll read this out, "Just because Australians are frustrated about traffic jams and population pressures encroaching on their way of life does not mean that they are anti-migrant or racist." Now, I agree that being frustrated by the traffic or worried about housing affordability isn't racist. But we've normalised a narrative that's too close to racism by persisting with the idea that immigration causes urban congestion or encroaches on our way of life. By the way, Australian politicians have promised to fix traffic congestion since basically forever. Search the newspaper archives and you'll find more than 20,000 articles about traffic problems. The headlines start around the time private cars were introduced. But in those days, people were blaming traffic congestion on the trams. Well, we know where that led. Just like traffic, you'll get a headline by saying Australia can't cope with more immigration. I watched the 60 Minutes special on population on Sunday night, and look, I have to say, it was gripping. They had an infographic with Australia so crowded that people were falling off the edges, definitely drowning, not waving. Dick Smith was flying around in a helicopter pointing out, new housing and high-rises and basically saying, we are concreting over this country. Well, it does sound very alarming. But right now, our very low population density, about 3.5 people per square kilometre, makes us just a little bit more crowded than Mongolia. Okay, we've got limited arable land and we've got a concentration in the coastal cities, and everyone is absolutely correct to say that our rate of growth at 1.6% per annum makes us, a world leader in rates of growth compared to other developed countries. But our base population is much lower. On that measure, we rank 55th. So our extra 400,000 people in a very big year is dwarfed by the 2.3 million extra Americans in the United States. For instance, almost a new Australia every decade, and their country is already 11 times denser than ours. If America stopped growing tomorrow, we'd catch up in terms of density in around 700 years. But why do we need to grow at all? Some people ask, except for, the economy. It is actually a good question, and the demographers tell us that our long-held population policy based on immigration topping up natural population growth has been about right. It's designed to offset our ageing population and diminishing tax base by keeping permanent migration at around 190,000, although of course we haven't been reaching that in recent years. At this level, we boost our skilled workforce, support family reunions in the community, and accept a small share of the world's refugees. Now, the important figure, of course, is the net overseas migration, total temporary and permanent migrants, plus returning Australians, minus people who leave. And this fluctuates, but reached a high of 300,000 a decade ago. We're around 236,000 today. Cutting the permanent intake won't necessarily bring down this number, but more importantly, it's very hard to see what it's going to do for, say, Sydney's traffic. Despite taking a lot of the growth over the last decade, government data shows us that average commuting times in Sydney and Melbourne have actually stabilised over the decade, and if anything, there's been a small decline. And that's because cities adapt to change. As we've seen in Sydney with employers moving towards business parks and suburban centres, we've seen our economic geography shift towards Parramatta. Doesn't mean we ignore congestion, but to fix congestion, we need to reduce car dependency rather than immigration. Australian cities were built around the private motor car, and it's not easy to change. But as we mature, we need to redesign around public transport and create walkable, cyclable neighbourhoods and well-connected centres. The real problem isn't how many people, but how we distribute growth. And in Australia, we are unbalanced. Sydney and Melbourne have grown by natural advantage in a global economy that favours cities for their deep, skilled labour pools. But the Planning Institute of Australia says we need a national settlement strategy, like most other grown-up countries, to address this imbalance and to improve regional quality of life. It's not about forcing people to regions, but attracting and keeping them with decent transport, universities, hospitals, proper environmental policy, and of course a functional NBN. But in calling out for sensible policy, no one seems to be listening. And should we really be surprised? Say national settlement strategy and the gentleman in the front row has fallen asleep. But blaming migrants for the housing market, now that's a headline. The Daily Telly knows how to sell policy, and, planners might need to take a lesson. Before migrants, planners copped the blame for housing, and of course, until it turned out that instead of blocking population growth and pushing up prices, they'd let through a tsunami of high-rise apartments, trying to talk like the Daily Telly now. But prices kept climbing, fuelled by easy finance, lower interest rates, and of course, tax incentives for property investment. It's time to stop scapegoating immigrants for previous policy neglect, and time to make sure that real urban housing and environmental problems can't be used as a front for racist sentiment. Thank you.